All right, let me just, as we're getting started, you good? We'll just kind of go over how this is going to go, and that way we can get people familiar that haven't been here before. What we're going to do is take about 45 minutes to do some Bible study. For those that have been in Digging Deeper before, we used to go about 90 minutes, so don't worry, we're not going to do that. We're going to break it down smaller. I'm going to try to do a little bit more smoothing things out. Digging Deeper has always been, for me, preaching is one thing, teaching is another. And so I've always used the Digging Deeper class to kind of do my studies to keep me fresh in the Scriptures. And so I didn't spend a lot of time on how to present it. I'm going to do a little bit more on presentation now that we're getting more of a diverse and it's kind of spreading out. And so here's how it will work, though. We'll do what we do every week. We'll gather together for worship. We'll come in here, and each message will stand on its own, even though we're going to be going through a book of the Bible. Each message will stand on its own. So if you miss one, don't feel like you have to drop out because you weren't here the last week. We know that life happens. Life happens to everybody. That means it's hard to do the same thing every week consistently. Just life doesn't work that way. And so we will be real careful to make sure that as we're teaching these classes, that will catch people up, and we won't lose you if you haven't been here for a few weeks or things like that. We'll make sure that it all ties together. But we do want to kind of go through the book of Acts. I don't know how long it's going to take. We're going to just go through the basic structure, and I'm going to share some things with you as we go through the book and familiarize you with it. But there'll be times that we'll just stop because I'll feel like there's something important or relevant to us that maybe for us in this time and season of our lives is more relevant to us than other times. Because literally we could, as a teacher, I could get lost in the Bible and never get out of Acts or any book of the Bible. And so I don't want to get bogged down. But we do want to give enough depth so that we can gain some deeper understanding. But we also want to make it relevant so that we can understand how it applies to our lives. Because really the part of the Bible we know is the part that we're able to help us raise our kids, pay our bills, figure out how to be good citizens, just kind of figure out how to do life. And so none of us are trying to be scholars per se. We're just trying to learn what God has to say in the Bible and find a way to better apply it to our lives. And so each message will stand on its own. And so tonight we're going to kind of do some review of the Bible, kind of like an introduction. We're going to be studying the book of Acts. The book of Acts is a historical book found in the New Testament part of the Bible, and we'll explain what that means in a minute. But it's kind of like, if you just pick a book out of the Bible, it's kind of like coming into a movie in the middle. Have you ever come into the movie in the middle of a movie? What do you do for the next 15, 20 minutes? You try to figure out who the characters are, right? And then you're trying to figure out what the storyline is. And by the time the movie's ending, you're just getting caught up with what's going on in the movie. It's kind of hard if you haven't seen the beginning. And so what we're going to do tonight is kind of like catch us up to where the book of Acts is in the whole overall picture of the Bible, so that we're not coming in the middle of a story and saying, what the heck is going on here? So, because that's the way you read a novel, right? How many of you start at the end of the novel and read back? I always look at the last page. I have to admit, I have to know what's going on, and I read. But usually we start at the beginning and we progress forward. And so what we're going to do is we just kind of do a review of the bigger picture of the Bible. Because the Bible, and we'll have some slides up here to help illustrate this. The Bible is really a story. The Bible runs a story from the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. It goes all the way through the book of Revelation, which is the book that everybody wants to read right out of the Bible. They get a Bible, they want to know different things about the end of the world and that kind of stuff. But it's kind of hard to start at that end because you kind of have to know what's going on before. And so the Bible's a story, and it's really the story of God. It's the story of God's relationship with us as human beings. It's the story of how God created us and what God's intentions are for us and how He's working to build a relationship with us. And it's a story also of how things have come into the world that have disrupted our relationship with Him. And so there's a story that runs starting in the book of Genesis when God creates mankind that leads up into a place called the nation of Israel. Modern Israel today comes from the roots of these people in the Bible. And God's relationship with Israel and how that works out. And it goes through a history of about 1,500 years of His relationship with that nation that leads us to the time of Jesus Christ and why Jesus came and what He was doing and what His mission was. And so that's the big picture of the Bible. And then, of course, the book of Revelation that ends the Bible kind of points to where God is trying to take us as a people, as a race, what His end game is. There's always an end game, right? When you play a football game, there's always a way to keep score, right? Now, don't raise your hand, but how many of your teams won this week? I said don't raise your hands. Because I want to raise my hand. My team won this week. It probably won't win the rest of the year. But they look good for 1 week. So we had a fun week in the Weed House. And the Eagles won and the Cowboys won. When they play each other, it's going to be real tense. And I might end up sleeping out on the couch. But you always have an end game, right? Whoever scores more points. In basketball, there's a goal. In football, there's an end zone. And so even in the Bible, there is an end. There is somewhere God is trying to take us. And though we don't see it clearly, we do understand some basic things that we hope to learn as we go along on our journey. And so the Bible is a story. And that story in the Bible is written in 2 sections. There's 2 parts. The beginning part is called the Old Testament. And the second part, I'm losing my notes already, is the New Testament. So there's what they call the Old Testament. Thank you, John. He's trying to get brownie points. There'll probably be an apple on my desk next week. There's an Old Testament, which is what we call the older part of the story, and the New Testament is a newer part of the story. And there's certain things that happen in these sections of the story, which we're going to kind of go over in just a few minutes. But John Stone Street writes something very interesting about stories. He says, in all good stories, something has gone wrong. Have you ever been watching TV and just kind of tired of things going wrong? So you start watching, like I was watching, I sat down to watch Little House on the Prairie, which we like to call the Little Outhouse on the Prairie, but that's a whole different story. But the Little House on the Prairie, and the story began to unfold, and I decided I'm too tired to have a problem, because I know Charles Ingalls is going to have a problem. Something bad's going to happen. Because in every story, they have something that goes wrong that they have to overcome, and that's what Stone Street's talking about. In every story, something has gone wrong, like the big bad wolf is trying to get Grandma. The White Witch turns Narnia into a place where it's always winter, but it's never Christmas, which is a bummer. Sauron amasses an army of orcs, goblins, trolls, and bad wizards, and other nefarious creatures to conquer Middle-earth. The biblical story is no different. In fact, we expect evil to invade any good story, because evil has invaded the story of the entire world. And that's what the Bible talks about. God created the world, but something has gone wrong, and God is telling the story in order for us to understand the larger story of our lives. That there is a bigger story. There is a bigger picture. There's a lot more going on in the world than just our little stories, which we call our individual lives, but our individual lives are very important. But if we're going to understand our story, our moment, our time in history, we're going to have to get an understanding of this bigger story. And that's what the Bible gives us. It gives us a bigger story. And so the Bible tells us how sin invaded the world, and that our first parents did their own thing, that's Adam and Eve, and then death and sin and suffering entered the world, and we have been dealing with it ever since. And so that's basically the Bible is a story telling us where we came from, what's gone wrong, what the fix is, what God is doing to fix what's wrong. Have you ever thought to yourself, there's something wrong with the world? You look at the news, you know there's something wrong with the world. Doesn't matter which channel you watch, but you look at some of the knuckleheaded things that people do and you go, what's wrong with people? Now, we're always thinking it's wrong with them, of course, but the truth of the matter is we all have something wrong with us and that God is trying to repair. And that's the story we get in the Bible. Now the Bible is divided into 2 sections, as I said. There's the Old Testament. I don't know if you can see that back there or not, but basically the Bible has an Old Testament, New Testament. You see these on the shelves here. You have the Old Testament and then you have the New Testament. And if you're going to if you're going to follow along in the Bible, there's basically 4 sections. 4 sections in each, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if you're thinking about the Bible, one big book, 2 sections. We call it the Old and the New. You can liken it to an old car, okay, like an old 1964 Mustang. Okay, or a 2019 Silverado. Okay, new. So you have old and you have new. Okay, now in the old section, in the first section, there's the first part, there's 4 sections. And in this New Testament, there's 4 sections, and they kind of mirror each other. Okay? And so when I learn something, I have to kind of figure out what to hang things to. Like I can't, how many of you like to just memorize stuff? I mean, just memorize. That's kind of hard to do that. So it's easier when we can associate what we're learning with something we know. And so there's 4 sections. I'm going to give you a picture of how that we can memorize this in just a moment. But there's 4 sections in the Old Testament, and then there's 4 sections in the New Testament. Now the Old Testament has 4 sections, and it starts with the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Law of Moses. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. It's called the Law, or the Law of Moses. Now you don't have to remember all this. Some of this is in your notes. I've given you, in fact, I've given you this in your notes. You can go home and you can try to memorize this, or not memorize it. Some people have all the books of the Bible memorized, of which are 66. Okay? And it takes a little while to memorize them. But the main thing I want us to get across is to feel. I don't want you to get all the information. I want you to get the feel of how the Bible flows, how the story is flowing. And so in the first section of the Old Testament, it's the law. Basically, it's like if you're building a house. We got any builders here? Any builders here build houses? No builders here? Has anybody ever built a house? Is anybody awake? Have I put you to sleep already? Okay, we all know what a house is, right? Okay, so if you're going to build a house, what do you start with? You start with a foundation. That's right. Okay. Now, if you picture building a house, and I probably didn't do this to scale. Probably need to do this again because the house is going to be too big. Okay. Let me do this. Hopefully, you can see it.
Your artwork hasn't gotten any better.
I am definitely artistically challenged. Okay, I'm going to warn you right now. Not only did I get an E in art, the teacher wrote down, I've never seen worse art than what I've had in the last year with you, Pastor Bob. If you think about it, there's basically 4 bricks in this foundation. The foundation is the law of Moses. That's in your paper, so I'm not going to write that on there. So that's your foundation. That's where everything starts in the Bible. When people want to go to the book of Revelation, whenever somebody gets inspired to study the Bible, they want to go to the book of Revelation. The problem is the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible, is basically a mosaic of all the Old Testament scriptures rewritten. And so if you don't understand this foundation, you're never going to come out with understanding that strange book which is at the end. Okay? And so we have to start with the foundation, which is the law. Then on top of that, as you're building a house, the second section is the floor and the walls. Make sure I get this right. Then there's the floor and the walls. Okay? And the walls are what they call the history part. This is the next section. From the 6th book of the Bible through another place, which I've got listed out here for you, which you can look at that later if you're really interested in learning more about that. Remember, we're just trying to get the flow. Is the walls are they tell the history of the nation of Israel. There's a story that's taking place. As God starts out in the first books, and He talks about how man was created and how man decides to do his own thing. If anybody's had kids, you know that kids want to do their own thing, right? Did you ever teach your kids to did you ever have to teach your kids, don't answer this. I never had to teach my kids to lie. Patty did that for them. She really got them lying all the time. No, I'm just kidding. I never had to teach them to lie. I never had to teach them to eat 3 or 4 extra cookies. There's things I just didn't have to teach my kids. They just kind of picked it up on their own. And that's part of the human condition. That there's certain things that we all have that we kind of lean a certain direction. So like if you ever driven a car that's out of front end, that's not in alignment, and it kind of pulls off the side of the road, and you kind of have to hold the steering wheel, there's something in each one of us that kind of pulls us in a direction. So that's what's covered in the first book of Genesis, in the first section. And then there's various things that it covers. And then God says, okay, I'm going to deal with a nation. I'm going to start working not just with the entire human race. I'm going to work with a specific person, and they're going to become a great nation called Israel. I'm going to work with that nation and really try to work some things out and try to pull them back from pulling to that one side. And unfortunately, it didn't really work. But that's the nation of Israel. So this is the history part. I don't want to write in there because I'll put some windows here. Okay. Then picture some windows and doors. I said my artwork leaves something to be desired. So picture a door. It's kind of like the third section of the Bible. It's called the prophets. A prophet in the Bible was called a seer because God would speak to them usually in visions, and He would speak directly to them. And they would see things and hear things. And so if you picture windows, windows you look out and you look in. And so as the Bible's building this story, it's building this story from the beginning. It takes us to the nation of Israel. And then during the historical part of Israel's history, the nation of Israel decided they were going to go their own way like our kids. And so God sent these prophets, which really were preachers, who went and would tell the people, look, I asked you to do this, and I told you to do this, and I told you to clean your room, and you're not cleaning your room. I told you to eat your vegetables, and you're not eating your vegetables. And the prophets were to bring people back to God and to get them on the right track. And so that's the historical part of the Old Testament. Okay? And then the final part, I skipped a part, I'm sorry. There's the wisdom literature, which is right before the prophets. It's 5 little books. I got to make sure that I'm getting this right. 5 little books of the Bible, which actually are the windows. I apologize. My analogy just went all to smithereens. Okay? So let me write this down because I'm getting lost here. The foundation, the walls. Make sure I get this. Is not in your notes. Okay, the living areas inside the room of the prophets. I'm sorry, but just picture a house, okay? Because it's really not important that you get this illustration. This is being taped. They're gonna have to edit it. It's all screwed up. Okay. But the idea, I'm just trying to associate something that you're familiar with. So you got a foundation, you got a floor, you got walls, you got windows. So there's a story that's being developed. These guys are laughing at me back there. I did not have chocolate today. I just want you to know. So. Then you have a second floor. Anybody have a 2-story home? Okay, so you got a 2-story home. You got walls that go up. So you have the same thing that takes place on the second story. You have 4 sections. So you start with the foundation, the law and the prophets. So the foundation of the New Testament is what we call the Gospels. Anybody ever hear the Gospels? The Gospels are basically the history of who Jesus is. Now, his story starts well after all this history that's taken place. He comes into the middle of the story, near the end of the story. And so that's why it's important as we get ready to study the book of Acts that we kind of know where we're coming into. There's been thousands of years that God's been working with people. It's not like, when God does something in the Bible, it's really easy for people to read something in the Bible. Let's say God gets mad and he does something, he spanks the kids. Now, I know there's no parents that get mad here and spank kids, but God every once in a while gets angry and he spanks his kids. Now, if we go in the middle of the Bible and just read it, right, just pick a page and open the Bible, whatever section we're in, we kind of think God gets ticked off all the time. But when you read it and know the story, you recognize it's been 500 years since the last time he got ticked off. And so the Bible says that God is long-suffering. But he's been putting up with these people for generation upon generation. Now he's kind of ticked off, just like you get every once in a while. Your kids do something, and every once in a while, honey, I need you to go do this. Honey, stop doing that. And it's honey, then it starts turning into, I told you not to do that. Right? Please don't do that. Then it's, you better not do that. Then it's, you wait till your dad comes home. And then, well, we can't talk about that. It's illegal after that. You're mad. Just kidding. It's a joke. The guys that don't know me, I'm just joking around. That's what happens with these stories in the Bible. Is there's things that lead up to them. There's things that are going on. And so it's very easy for people to read the Bible and get misperceptions about what's happening because they don't understand the context. And so as we're looking through this, even though I messed up my illustration, I can't believe I messed this illustration up. I just want you to think 4 sections in the New Testament, Old Testament. That's a story that's running. This is part of, as a pastor, one of the things I've noticed over the last 10 to 15 years that's kind of missing in a lot of our church preaching today. Is we do a lot of sermons on topics and things to help people with topical things that they're dealing with in life. But more and more, whoever the experts are telling us that people are losing the sense of the biblical narrative, of the story. There is a story that runs from Genesis to Revelation. God creates us. He gives us autonomy and authority over the earth. He says, you have dominion over the earth. I want you to run the planet. I want you to take care of it. That's why Christians ought to be leading and keeping our environment clean. We're charged to take care of the world. We don't want dirty water and dirty air. We should be managing it well because that's part of the job God gave us. But then something called sin entered the world, and we became very selfish, and we get very self-oriented. And that leads to all kinds of problems, which unfold in the book of Genesis, in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, through the history of Israel. And finally, God sends Jesus Christ at the end of the Old Testament time period to die on the cross. Years ago, our church, when the movie The Passion came out, does anybody remember what the movie The Passion was about? Anybody remember who put it together? Mel Brooks? He said Mel Brooks. It was not Mel Brooks. That was the other movie, Blazing Saddles. Mel Gibson put that, and it was about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We bought about 1,000 tickets, and we sent people free, just gave tickets away to people to see the movie. One of the biggest comments that we got from the people that got the tickets was this: the story made no sense to them. Why is he being crucified? Why are they doing this to this man? They had no basis for understanding a lot of them for the story that went around that story. And even though that is one of the most accurate descriptions of crucifixion, because it was brutal. Okay, I mean, I cried through the whole thing. I just couldn't bear to watch it at times because it's accurate. But without the rest of the story, it was kind of hard to understand, why are they treating this guy like this? What does it mean? And that's why, as we get ready to go into the book of Acts, we just want to kind of open up with just a general understanding of where are we in the story with the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts is coming in kind of near the end. Now let me catch up because I'm totally off basis. And for those of you who may not been at Eagles Nest before, I'm warning you, I'm very ADD. Some people even accuse me of being ADHD. And so we're going to now look, so I've got to get back to my notes to make sure I'm staying on task here. But the Old Testament, when you think of the Old Testament, so if you think of two sections in the Bible, you got the Old Testament and the New Testament. I can do this. This example will work. I'm smart enough for this. The Old Testament gives us a panoramic picture of God. It gives us the big picture of Him, who He is. If you've ever gone to, I don't know what mountains these are, they kind of look like the Grand Tetons out there in Wyoming. But if you ever go to a mountain, you stand at the foot of a mountain, you just go, wow. That is huge. That is awesome. If they're far away. Have you ever driven out west and you're driving and you see the mountains far away and it's like you're going to be there in 20 minutes and you keep driving and driving and driving, but they never seem to get there, and the closer you get, the bigger they get? That's what the Old Testament picture gives us. It gives us a big picture view that God is powerful. God is amazing. God is intelligent and smart and wise, and He's a little scary. In fact, He's a lot scary. Because you're getting a big picture view of God. And so all through the Old Testament, when you're reading this, you got to remember He's talking to an entire nation. He's not talking to individuals most of the time. He's talking to a whole country. It'd be like getting on TV and doing a press report to our entire nation. So it's constantly talking about the bigness of God because He's dealing with a nation. And so that's the picture you get. Not that there's not little glimpses along the way, but that's the dominant theme of the Old Testament. And those four sections: the law and the prophets, the history books, the poetry of the writings, which is the wisdom of their era that they got from God, and then the prophets, which were the ones that basically preached the word and brought people back to God. That's basically what they're giving. God is awesome. He's big. He loves you. He wants great things to happen for your life. And then He gives them some rules and regulations. Says, hey, if you just follow these 10 rules, life will be good. Just 10. Just keep these 10, the 10 commandments. He says your life will be better. Don't murder each other. That's probably a good rule. What do you think? Don't kill each other. Like if we came here tonight, it'd be like saying, don't take a baseball bat and start hitting each other over the head. That's a good rule. He says don't steal. Just don't take each other's stuff. I like that. Don't take my stuff. Do you want me to take your stuff? And He gives them 8 other rules. And He says, hey, this is how I want you to treat one another. And this is how I want you to treat me. Here's the big picture. I'm pretty awesome. You might want to listen to me. Okay? Then there's the New Testament. The New Testament gives us, and I covered this recently, so for some people this is a little bit of a review, but in the New Testament we have a close-up picture of God. When God becomes a man, God takes on a human body. He becomes one of us. Now in the Old Testament, when you got close to God, He kind of scared you. Have you ever met somebody like famous? You know, and you get to go like backstage, or you get to be somewhere where they are, and you actually get to meet them. Has anybody here ever experienced something like that? A couple of you? Anybody else? Everybody living a sheltered life here? I mean, I guess we're just going to have to let them get backstage and meet me next week. When they're on the stage, you get the big picture of them. They're bigger than life, aren't they? Kind of intimidating. I've met a few important people in my lifetime, and it's like, from afar, it's not so bad, but when you go in the back room, you're kind of nervous. Kind of make you nervous. That's kind of what happened in the Old Testament. God shows Himself to be really big and powerful. And though He's loving, He's kind of scary. But then Jesus was born. And God became a man. And He took on human flesh. What is more approachable than a newborn baby? The Bible is very clear that baby Jesus on Christmas was God in a body. And Pastor Bob, you explained that. I can't. Nor can I explain how He could create everything. Nor can I explain the miracles that I've seen. I've seen real miracles. Seen them. I can't explain them to you, but I know they happened. I saw them. And so I know this stuff is real. It's not being made up. Don't understand it, but God became a man, and He became very approachable. And in the New Testament, you get a very close-up picture of who Jesus is. 4 sections. There's a foundation, the Gospels. There's historical books. That's the book of Acts, which we're going to be studying. There's practical wisdom, which is the letters of the Bible. Don't try to get all this. I'm trying to smooth this out. And then there's the book of Revelation, which is prophecy, which we'll get a chance to talk about as we go through this study. But very simply put, there's a big picture and a close-up picture. Now, we are coming in on the story near the end. So think about a book. What's your favorite book? You got it? Or favorite movie? Got it? What's your favorite book? Got a favorite book or movie?
Fountainhead.
Fountainhead. Okay. Somebody else?
Jane Eyre.
Jane Eyre? Come on, you guys are quiet. You're making me nervous. That's why I messed up my illustration. You're making me nervous. You're so quiet. Okay.
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote. Oh, okay. Someone else?
Godfather.
The Godfather. Who said that? Jane. I'm going to give you an offer you can't refuse. Now think about this. Let's say you've never read the books or seen the movies, but you come in on the last few pages. That's what we're doing when we come into the book of Acts. The book of Acts was written somewhere around 70 AD. Okay, 70 AD of our era. AD. The Bible doesn't, most books of the Bible, if not all of them, were written before that. So we're coming to the end of the story. And so as we go through it, I'm going to constantly be reminding you of the rest of the story. Does anybody remember Paul Harvey? What was Paul Harvey's line? We're going to tell you the rest of the story. There is a rest of the story. So as we open the book of Acts, we are coming in on the end of the story. Now it's a panorama. It's not a panoramic view. It's an up front, close, personal view. Does anybody know why I picked a picture of a lion up close? Aslan. Yeah. Because Jesus is considered a lion. He's a king. And see how you get a close-up picture of a lion? That's what the story around the book of Acts is. The Gospels in the New Testament, the second section of the Bible, tells the story of Jesus' birth. Why He was born. The nation He was born into was Israel. Why He came. What He did while He was here. What we did, how we responded as human beings by God showing up. You know, we would think that if God showed up, if God came in here today in human flesh again, we think that people would just kind of feign and love Him, just receive Him. That's really not what happened. Some did. But a lot of people got mad at Him and tried to kill Him. And in the end, they did kill Him. And the Bible tells us that He wasn't really killed. He surrendered His life. on the cross, and then he rose again on the third day. That he rose again and was seen alive after he was dead. That's how we'll see as we get into the book of Acts. Acts starts. So we come into the story near the end, where God has been working with a group of people to try to help them get on track, clean the room, not sin, not do bad things, treat one another the right way. They haven't been doing it. Now he sends Jesus who paid the price for forgiveness. It's kind of like if your kid doesn't clean the room and it's a mess and you clean the room for them. That's what God did on the cross. We had a mess, and Jesus died for the mess we created. And now he wants to work in our lives to clean up that room, to clean up our lives. Not because he loves us any less if our room's a mess. It's because our messy room ain't good for you. I mean, there are days I could see critters in my boy's room. They're like, man, when are you going to clean that thing up? There's critters. I've been calling the termite people and the pest control people, but they keep telling us you got to get all the food out of your room. It's a mess. And so God wants to clean our messes not because he'd love us more, but because he does love us. And he loves us in our mess. So that's kind of what leads up to the book of Acts. All right? Because the Bible is a story about God's relationship with us. Now, are there any questions before I go on in this? Pretty self-explanatory. Other than my illustration of the house, it was pretty clear. I told you I'm not an artist. It takes too much brain power for me to do art. As soon as I start drawing, things go crazy. All right. Now, the people's stories that we read about, their stories are framed by the bigger picture. In other words, to understand the stories behind the people we're going to meet, we kind of have to remember the story about God, where we are in the story. It's kind of like if I used this illustration in the past, I'll use it again. But if I wrote a letter to my wife, let's say I went out to California for a month because I had some classes out there, and I wrote a letter to my wife and sent it by snail mail, and but the letter gets lost in the mail, it gets blown out of the truck, and it's somewhere in Arizona, and it's in the desert, and it gets buried. And 100 years from now, somebody digs up that letter, and they start reading that letter that I wrote to my wife in 2019. In order for them to understand that letter, to understand what's in that letter, we have to kind of understand a little about what our life was like. They'd have to know where we lived, how long we've been married, how many kids we had, what we did for a living, those kind of things. That's the same truth as it is when you read these Bible characters. So you meet people like Moses. Anybody ever hear of Moses? Okay, so Moses is the one that gets the Ten Commandments. So you kind of have to know a little bit of story about his life and what God is doing. And then we meet other people. We meet like King David. Most people have heard about David. David was the greatest king the nation of Israel had. But there's things that are going on around his life that God is doing in a bigger picture that kind of give meaning to the story of his life. And it's also true of our lives. Our lives have a bigger story around them. And one of the things that I think that we're struggling with in our culture today, because our culture is what we call postmodern. Postmodern basically means post-reason. A lot of people hear that term and we're throwing these terms around, but postmodern means that basically for 400 to 500 years, our culture was organized around thinking and reasoning. A thing called the Enlightenment, where we became thinkers and we thought through everything and we had answers for everything. And then science came along and science displaced religion. Science came along and said, you can't trust what's in the Bible because we know better. We know about this and we know about that. But you know what's happening now in postmodernism is we're not just rejecting Christianity, we're actually rejecting reasoning and thought. Because we realize now that there's more to life than just 2 + 2, and there's more to life than just being able to look in a telescope and see a star. There's more to life. And so what's happening in our younger generation, they're saying there's got to be more than just math and algebra and science and all these things. So we're hungering for something that's deeper, aren't we? And so the older folks are like scratching their heads, and younger saying, well, don't you get it? And we have to understand we need both. We need reason and emotion, and we need reason to live. And so there's a larger story. But what's happening as we're kind of rejecting the past is we're losing the sense of the story, where we came from. We don't know who we are because we don't know our history. You know, I have, well, I need to be careful what I say, but I've ministered to a lot of people as a pastor. And it's amazing to me how when I minister to people and people come in, we talk, it inevitably goes back to where they came from, who they were, who their parents were, where they grew up, finding out their story. What do we do when we go to a party? When we go to a party, we introduce ourselves. We usually have something in our hands, because you know why people have something at a party? Because they can hide behind it. You never go into a party without a glass, because you got to have something to hide behind. That's why people drink at parties. Just fill it with Coke. You don't need this other stuff. Drink with water. So you can hide behind it. But what do you do when you go to parties? Hi, I'm Bob. What's your name?
John.
John. Well, John, what do you do for a living?
I teach.
You teach. What do you teach?
Nursing.
What kind of grades do you give? What do you charge?
Tough grade.
You give me a good grade? You get to know them, right? You get to know their story. You get to know, and relationship building is all about getting to know each other's story, getting to know what each other's about. If you're ever stuck, for some of you more introverted people, and I'm very introverted, I have a hard time talking in public. If you ever get stuck at a party, first of all, grab a glass and hide behind it. Second of all, just remember who, what, where, when, why, and how. Just ask questions. You know, you're getting nervous, like, oh, what am I going to say? Just ask a question. Hey, have you always had that gray hair? Yeah, that's probably not a good question. Pretty much, you know.
I'm just happy to have hair.
That's true. I'm following the challenge. Just ask. Just get to know them. Just, you know, where did you grow up? You know, what do you do for a living? Get to know their story, because once you get to know their story, you're getting to know them. And then they're going to ask you, most people, if you start asking them questions about where they work, they're going to ask you, where do you work? What do you do? And that's when you begin to develop relationship and community. So it's really not as scary as we think. That's what's happening in the Bible, in the Old Testament. God's introducing Himself. This is where I come from. This is who I am. This is who you are. And then we get into the New Testament and we begin to meet the New Testament characters. We begin to find who are they. They are, but they're part of this bigger story that's going on in the Bible. And that story has continued from the first century till now. There is a bigger story happening in the world. And we desperately need to teach our children. I'm going to say something here that not everybody's going to agree with, especially when it goes online. But I believe this to the core of my being. We've had a school here. We work with Delmarva Christian School. We've been very thick in education here. Believe in education very much so. You know, support public schools, sports. You know, we all for education. But I personally have become convinced that history is more important than math. Because it doesn't do us any good to be able to add up and subtract everything if we don't know who we are. And one of the challenges we're having in our society is that we don't know who we are as Americans. We don't know who we are as Christians. And we don't know who we are as non-Christians. And it's because we've been taught math, but we haven't been taught history. We haven't been taught where we come from. And the stories we do get about where we come from, well, when we get into science and that kind of thing, we'll have a discussion on it. But folks, if you can do anything for your kids, hear me now, I'm getting real serious. This is off topic. This is free. Give them a history. Give them traditions. Give them values. You know, one of the reasons we're doing dance is we want to help families. We want to help families to be able to help their kids, to be able to navigate through life. I was just reading Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled. Anybody ever hear that book? Mm-hmm. You know, I was going to name a series called The Road Less Traveled. It's less traveled for a reason, but I decided to use a different title. But Scott Peck was saying in there, he said, and he's a psychiatrist, psychologist, somebody who spent his life helping people in this area. He said if a person can get a good identity when they're a kid, it can almost never be stripped from them when they're an adult. But if they don't get a good identity as a kid, it's very hard, not impossible, but very difficult to make it up when they get older. And we've got to give our kids a foundation to understand how their story fits, where they come from. If you've ever talked to adopted people, people that have been adopted, adoption is a wonderful thing. I got 2 adopted kids. It's amazing. But one of the questions they all ask when they get to a certain stage is where they came from, who their parents were, biological, because it's in us. And so this is why the Bible's important. The Bible's important because it gives us a story from the beginning. It's interesting that if you study history, secular history starts about 400 BC. That's when we got history the way we read history and do history today in the modern sense, about 400 BC. The Bible's history in the Old Testament stops at 400. And so we have a history of the world which experts have looked at. Historians believe the Bible, by the way. They trust the Bible. They trust it more than theologians. I don't trust theologians when I read them because half of them don't believe the Bible. I go read a history book. The guy in the history class believes the Bible because they've studied history. They know these things have happened. They have different philosophies on why it happened. But the Bible gives us a foundation to build our identity around. And so we come into the New Testament in the book of Acts when Jesus Christ, so here's what's happened. Jesus Christ has come to the earth. He's been born of a virgin. He's miraculously born. He ministers to people for 3.5 years. He heals the sick. He does incredible miracles that have been testified, attested to. We crucify him. He dies on the cross. He's risen the 3rd day, and then he appears to about 500 people after he's dead. We think that he just appeared to a few people. He appeared to 500 people in one setting who knew he was dead, and he proved he was alive. And since then, people have been passing on that testimony, that witness, that Jesus Christ was dead, and now he's alive. And now there's a lot of other things that the story talks about, but that's where we pick the story up in the book of Acts, is that Jesus is now gathering his 12 disciples, his original 12, and actually there's more than that, but we'll get into that next week. And that's where the story in the book of Acts picks up. And so, as we get into that next week, we want to remember there's a story that goes on before it, but we also want to apply it to our own lives here tonight. Where are you in the story? Do you understand the bigger story of your life? Do you understand God's story? If you want to know more about it, certainly talk to me after tonight's lesson. Okay? And so just remember that the book of Acts starts near the end of the story, and it can be very difficult for some coming into it without an understanding. That's why every week as we talk, I'm going to do the best I can to keep us up to speed on the story. Now every story has an outline. We all took English class, English Lit. Don't raise your hand how many liked English Lit. Ugh. My brother, who is very mechanically inclined, told me when he went into the 9th grade, he said, "Robert, I'm going to be working on cars the rest of my life. I don't need to do any more English." And he did. And while he can't write, he can't read, he can put a car back together. No, he can read. But every day used to tell you to write a short story, you have to create an outline. When you're studying anything, really, if you're studying any kind of story, you really need to look at the outline. That's what you do with the Bible. Find out what the outline is. And the book of Acts is basically divided into 2 simple sections that we're going to look at. Now, you can get more complicated than this, but I'm just not that smart. I can't remember all this stuff. So I keep trying to keep things simple, so I can remember them. Okay? And so the Bible has two parts. What's the first one? Old car. And then the New Testament, the new car. Okay, the Old Testament is kind of like it's kind of like an old Ford, beat up Ford pickup truck. And then in the New Testament, it's kind of like a brand new Chevy, And there's how many sections in each part? 4. Okay, and if you think about it, even though I screwed up the example, you'll probably remember that more. Nobody will remember anything else I got to say, but next week everybody will be talking about how screwed up my house was. Okay, that was really on purpose so you'd remember. 4 sections, and now we pick up the story in the of the book of Acts at the end of it. But there's basically 2 parts to this story. All right, in chapters 1 through 12, there's the ministry of a guy called Peter. Anybody ever hear Peter? Yeah, he's the most famous Christian other than Jesus, that probably wasn't Paul, that there's ever been. Peter was Jesus' top disciple. He was the number 2 guy on the org chart, if you will. Peter was the guy that Jesus had 12 disciples or 12 people that he trained, and he had 3 that were his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, and Peter was the top one. Peter was the one that Jesus confided in. It's like having a best friend. Jesus had a best friend. Can you believe it? Because human beings need friends. I mean, there is no part of our lives that the Bible doesn't touch upon and give us wisdom. Jesus needed friends. Jesus, even though he was God in the body, could not be a friend to 5,000 people. And neither can you. I've heard through the years that people come to churches and they'll, in fact, I'll just say it like this. People have come here and they're looking for a church and they say, well, I used to go so-and-so, but they have cliques there. And I said, no, they don't have cliques there. They're just like Legos. They can't get any more relationships. They're full. You have a kid, you got kids. I know you got kids in here. You know what a Lego is? You can only put so many Legos on a Lego. Okay? That's what happens with relationships. And we all need one best friend. We all need 3 good friends. We need 12 really close friends. We need a bigger group of people that we don't know as well. There are circles of friendships that we all need if we're going to have a healthy life. And these are all modeled for us in the Scripture. And Jesus models this for us because he had this guy named Peter, and Peter was a real knucklehead. You think some of your friends are kind of, Peter was a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Peter was an interesting guy, and yet he was Jesus' best friend in our language. And this guy, Peter, is who we're going to read about predominantly, and what God does through his ministry in the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. In the chapters 13 through 28, we meet a guy named Paul, and we find out about his ministry. And the Bible, the book is often called the Acts of the Apostles, but really the book of Acts should be called the Acts of Peter and Paul, because they're the predominant 2 characters in the book. All right? And from there, we're going to learn a lot of things. There's so much in this book. I'm going to try real hard to refrain from going so deep into my theological stuff that it's not worth any, day-to-day good. But there's some things that philosophically that we learn in this book. We're going to run up against philosophers. We're going to run up against all kinds of people that truthfully have shaped the world. Things that we think that are new to us were actually, they were talking about 2,000 years ago. It's all in there. And things that will help us to kind of orient ourselves in our daily lives. So, Acts is a story, just like the rest of the Bible is a story. And for the last final point is there's 3 prominent churches we're going to meet. We're going to meet 3 central churches in the book. And I'm not even go over them because you won't remember them anyway. But we'll go over it over and over again. And by the time you're done, you'll be familiar with these churches and why they're there. There's a very strong reason why there's things that are written in the Bible the way they are. And they help us today. They give us wisdom and perspective on our lives today. I've read in my lifetime, I don't know how many books. I'm a reader. I've never read anything, thousands of books. I've never read anything like the Bible. To be able to give you wisdom and direction and understanding for everyday life. Now, there's a lot of parts of the Bible I still don't understand. There's parts that are just, beyond me. But there's a lot of things we can know, and that's what we're going to look at. All right? So, as I'm wrapping this up, are there any questions, anything you want me to clarify? Any questions you have? This is a good time. They're not going to release our kids for another 10 minutes. And so, do you have any questions about where we're going? Anything I said? Did I confuse you? Am I helping you? Any questions about anything? Life, where to invest money. What, we can help you with that. You just open the Bible and go, Fund 45. Just kidding. No questions? No? All right. Sure? Going once? Going twice? I don't know what that means. I'll know next week when I see the crowd. Okay. The second week is always a critical week because I find out really what people are thinking.
You said that Peter was the best friend of Jesus. What was John?
John was another best friend. Yeah, you can have 2 best friends, can't you? Maybe he was the bester friend.
Bester.
The bester. Good and gooder. Patty's, anything else? What would...
Jesus love.
What's that? She's telling me that we still got more time left, right? That's what you're trying to tell me. See, we've been married 31 years. She didn't even say the words. I just looked over and said, I'm doing something wrong. Okay. Really, what I'm trying to do, yes, Eric.
The Gospel of John, was that written by Jesus as John?
Yes. Yes. Now, the Gospel of John may be one of the few books that was written past 70 AD. There's, when we study these things, there's different debates over when certain things, but there's always within a few years. But my bias is after years of study, and for those who are just getting to know me, that I don't know everything for sure. I think I know everything, but I don't know everything. Is based on everything I've seen over the years. I'm pretty confident that all the books, except maybe the Gospel of John, was written before 70 AD. And I'm pretty certain that it was written, but I'll leave the door open before 70. And there's reasons for that. But they were all written before the end of the first century, for sure. Okay, and if any of you heard the Jesus Seminar or the Da Vinci Code stuff, okay, the Da Vinci Code stuff, what you're getting in the Da Vinci Code is very poor history. Because the Da Vinci Code, I read the Da Vinci Code when the book came out, and then I saw the movies. And the Da Vinci Code stuff is based on writings that were written around 300 AD. So they're 200 years older than the Gospels, and they're trying to tell us to believe them, even though they're weird. Okay? Versus the Gospels and the writings we have in the New Testament. And when you study, I studied this when I was in my 20s because I went through a crisis of faith. I walked into church. I was an epileptic. I was having grand mal seizures every 28 days. I asked God to help. He instantaneously healed me. I never had a seizure from that night. I had an encounter with God. He healed me, spoke to me, told me I was healed. Never had a seizure again. And in about 23, 24 years of age, because of the seizures I had, I knocked my front teeth out, and my front teeth began to die. And they had to put them back in, and they began to die. And I went through a real crisis of faith because I walked out of a church healed, and then my front teeth died, and it was a real crisis of faith and a real crisis of looks. And I was engaged to be married, and Patty was thinking twice about marrying me. She said, "You got no teeth." I don't know. There's no teeth in this relationship.
You want to mention at all about who wrote Acts?
I'll get into that next week. Yeah. And so he wanted me to say Luke wrote Acts, but we'll get into those details a little bit more next week. But I went through a crisis of, can I trust the Bible? And I did about 2 to 3 years of study where I read about where these writings came from, because there's 66 books in the Bible. And after 2 or 3 years of study, I was convinced by what the historians said, not theologians, that the Bible you have was written around 70 AD, and that these stories took place because historians used them to document things. And this idea of Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code, that the Bible's just some guys got in a room and chose what books that they were going to put in the Bible, is all false. But this is part of what's happening with what I say people don't know history. If you don't know history, you don't know that. You think, oh, well, okay, the Bible is just a made-up book. It is not just a made-up book. The books that are in the Bible are in there for a reason. There's witnesses and evidence that we'll see next week. We're talking about evidence. There's evidence that affirms why they're there. And the process that people talk about is just ignorance. And if we don't know any better, and that's why I say we in the church world and our churches, we've got to begin to educate a little bit better. And just not, and I want to inspire you, but there's more than inspiration. We can inspire you and get you all jacked up. But folks, we'll just be inspired idiots if we don't learn something. And our kids need to learn, because everything that they're being taught in our culture is to throw out the past. That's what postmodernism is leading to, and not everything in the past is bad. In fact, a lot of things in the past are good, like the 90s, the Cowboys won 3 Super Bowls. That's a good thing. We want to hold on to those rings. I got all 5 Super Bowl rings on my desk at home. Okay, we want some more. Patriots got 6, but we just have to deal with that. So yes.
Can you elaborate on why you refer to the Gospels as New Testament law?
The law of the kingdom. The Gospels, I'm kind of associating with the law of Moses. Jesus is like a second Moses. Some scholars talk about giving, like on the Sermon on the Mount, giving his gospel laws of the kingdom. That's why I refer to that. Yeah, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm trying to associate the foundation. The Gospels are the foundation of the New Testament. Jesus fulfills the Old Testament promises, and then he builds from there the second floor of the story of God. That's a good question. Hold me, my feet to the fire. That's good. Anyone else? Patty, how we doing? We don't have to fill our time. Like, one of the things I want to try to pace this, because I know it's easier for me to talk than you to listen, especially after a day of work, a midday hump day. But I promise you, look, the goal of Wednesday nights is not to get you all pumped up and fired up, though I'll try to do things to make you laugh. I'll try to do things to keep you awake. But the real bent is to try to help you learn and grow in your understanding of the Scriptures, so that God can talk to you through the Scriptures and you not get weird things from too much pizza. Because people tell me the Bible says, and I'm like, the Bible don't say that. We have to learn how to read the Bible. You just can't pick it up and pick and choose. Because when you start to do that, you can make it say anything you want. And there is a story that helps you to understand where things fit. It's kind of like the human body. The human body has a skeleton, right? And so you get to know the shin bone's connected to the hip bone, and the hip bone's connected to the backbone, and the backbone's, there's a structure. Okay, I'm just trying to keep you awake. There is a structure to the Bible that you'll learn as we go through just by repeating it. So you want to go home and memorize it. And so as you begin to read your Bible will begin to change. For years I would say to people, just study the Word and get direction, and say, how? Well, that's what we're going to be teaching you, basically by going through. This is how you can get direction for your life, by reading the Bible. The Bible is an amazing book. When God He'll begin to speak to you, He'll give you wisdom. He'll make you look smart. He'll make you look smarter than anybody else in the room if you follow what He says. It really does work. So that's what our goal is, yes.
I just have a question. When we were in Digging Deeper, we'd have, for like 8 weeks and like a particular part of the Bible. Where this is going to continue, is this going to be in Acts for like a year?
We'll be in Acts for about 5 years.
Just keep going and going.
I don't know how long it's going to take, because some sections will go very quickly. Other sections, like when we get to Acts 17, I need to do at least 4 weeks in that chapter. Because there's things that are relative to what we're dealing with every day. We think that what's going on in our culture is new. It is not new. It's all there. And I'll bring that out. So I'll need more weeks. Other weeks will go by quicker. I hope to get it done in a year. But this much I can say, we're going to make each message stand on its own. And then each one is being videotaped. So if you really want to learn and study the book of Acts and learn more, you can go to the videotape. If you miss a week, if you don't, that's fine. If you're just here waiting for your kids and you don't want to sit alone, you'll get a little something by just listening. Everybody's a different level of interest in what they're trying to do in their lives and what season of life they're in, and I recognize that. But we're gonna not try to get bogged down. We're gonna try to keep it fresh. We might take some detours, like take some breaks, because if I see everybody getting tired of Acts, like we'll take a break and we'll do something to freshen it up. But literally, folks, there's so much in this one book. It just amazes me. It's gonna be hard for me to narrow it down. Yes.
I was just going to say, you mentioned your body. A little thing I heard stuck with me. It says most people think your body has a spirit, but it's your spirit that has the body. So if you
This
think
is
about
true.
it-
We are a spirit. We have a soul within the body. That means they're getting ready to come out. The calm before the storm. All right, if anybody has any questions, like to introduce themselves, I'll be up here for a few minutes. Make sure you take, if you brought 3 kids, you take 3 kids home. Okay? I hope you come back next week as we get into the book. We're just kind of feeling our way to get started. Thank you.